The Eudora Welty Writers Symposium began in October 1989. Dr. Clyda Rent was new president, and she wanted a literary event as part of her inauguration, and something that would pay tribute to Eudora Welty, something that would bring community and students to the campus.
From the beginning, we wanted it to be an annual symposium.
We had hoped it would be successful, and bringing Eudora Welty to campus, I think, assured the success of the initial program.
The fact that she was an alumna of the university and had attended 2 years, I think it was not unrealistic for us to claim her more openly and proudly the way we did, because she had always done the same for us. She had not forgotten what she had benefited from, and she didn't forget that it was here, as she said, she heard all of the voices in the state. It was the first time she heard the voices from the Delta, the voices from the coast, and it gave her more of that sense of place that she describes as so important in her fiction.
Her work was astonishing to me, especially in the way she captured not only normal people's voices, but voices I heard when I came to Mississippi, and in fact my parents' voices. And not only colloquialisms, but the certain kinds of codes everybody in a particular region use. And I think the biggest influence she had on me early on was just this extremely rich sense of place. When I entered a Welty story, I really lost myself in industrial Baton Rouge, and I was someplace in Mississippi. And also one of maybe my favorite Welty story is No Place for You, My Love, which is set in Louisiana. I'm sure that has something to do with it. But the element of mystery in that story is so pervasive, and that landscape, even though it wasn't exactly my landscape, on that drive to Venice, Louisiana, is really haunting and actually made me want to take that drive.
That she was able to create this wonderful world from a small world. You know, you think of, I think of writers, or when I was younger, as living in New York and having to be part of a hustle and bustle. She wasn't like that at all. She did all of this in her house, a beautiful house with a beautiful garden in Mississippi. So that attracted me to her. Her imagery is really good. She was just very true to her times, what she's writing about. I think that you get an accurate picture in her fiction of what the South was like at the time she was writing about it. It is not a glamorized picture, but it's not a very negative picture, too. It is very well modulated. That's what I really like about her. I think she's giving me insight as I read her. I think I have this quote in my last book, The Year Between Us, that Eudora Welty, a journalist, once asked her, how come there are so many writers coming out of the state of Mississippi? And she paused for a second, and then she said, I guess it's because we have so much explaining to do. And the South is like that. You know, there's just a lot of explaining that in a lot of different stories, a lot of different parts of stories, just a lot of history here, many, many tales.
The Shoebird was a production of the demonstration school, which was on the campus of MUW at the time. Dr. Rand had wanted to involve demonstration school students in some way in her inauguration.
It involved them singing songs. Betty Bryan played the piano. There were speaking parts. The children were wonderful. For one thing, they were enthusiastic, excited to be there, well rehearsed, none of this shuffling around and looking at the floor. They knew that they were doing something important because Miss Welty was in the audience. The big conclusion is when all of the children decide that they are going to try to fly together, and they had their feathered wings, and they started flapping their wings and flapping their wings.
And at the end of the program, Eudora Welty led a standing ovation. She stood up and flapped her arms in tribute to the students for the production of the shoe bird. It was a very touching moment and an exciting one for both the students and the proud parents, of which I was one.
I'll never forget that. It made a huge impression on me. And she thought nothing of it. People asked her about it afterward, and she said, well, I just thought that was the natural thing to do.
One of the things that we have tried to do with the symposium over the years is to bring in a mix of established writers and new writers.
We have a great history of finding great talent in the South. There's lots of great talent out there in the South. We have a good record of finding people early on in their careers
who have gone on to be very established writers. So it's been exciting for us. We work hard at looking for young talent because there's a lot of good writing going on out there, and to bring the young writers to campus.
This year's theme was Homesick for Somewhere, displacement, loss, and longing in the South. And of course it comes from Eudora Welty's story, Kin, where the narrator talks about her great-grandmother's portrait, and the woman is looking out as if she's homesick for somewhere. And that started to resonate with some of the themes in Tim Parrish's work, especially this idea of displacement, of looking for, longing for a place that is here, but isn't quite the same as here. I don't think I could have picked a better person. And his energy and his enthusiasm for the symposium is really unmatched. He asked questions at every session, was fully engaged all of the time. I love the themes in both his novel, The Jumper, and his memoir, Fear and What Follows, which is his memoir about growing up in Baton Rouge during the time when the schools were being desegregated, and he gets involved in some really tough street violence and begins to get involved with some really racist groups. And he is now, many years later, going back to that material and trying to look at why did he do it, what was going on in his community, and what was going on personally for himself. So that exploration of racism from that very deep, introspective, personal level was very engaging for me.
In the memoir, quite obviously, I'm writing about my past, but I think also trying to reconcile a lot of the things I did as a racist and a practicing racist as a kid, and make sense of the entire culture I grew up in, looking at it from a very different vantage point, but also the element of longing in there. Just, I think in some ways, longing for a different kind of past, even though I've accepted the past. It helps me a little bit to be less homesick, living as a Yankee now. But anytime I read in Mississippi, it really connects me to my parents and a lot of my relatives. I used to spend a lot of summers in Mississippi at my Aunt Hazel, Uncle Cheryl, and Papa Parrish's farm. So coming here it's kind of getting back to the roots of my existence, not necessarily my growing up. My memoir, Fear and What Follows, is about a number of things. It started off being primarily about masculinity and how a kind of, I'd say, perverted code of masculinity led me to doing things, violent things, kind of despicable things, and having that I probably wouldn't done if I hadn't been influenced by that code. This code also led me to believing that in order to fit into my masculine society, I had to enact racial violence. And that's at the heart of the book, but really the title does say it, Fear and What Follows, because when I grew up in a very prejudiced church environment and home environment, even though there were a lot of loving people there. And I wanted to show the complexity of those people. So, racists are people, and they're complex people, and they come from a lot of different places, but I think primarily they come from a place of fear. And when I was 13, I got in this pretty horrendous street fight in which I almost got stabbed. It was with a white kid. It had nothing to do with race. Before he could stab me, this older kid who was a notorious criminal in our neighborhood pulled him away, but then that kid began to stalk me. So at 13, I really had the fear in my bones. And at 15, by some crazy coincidence, the most brutal, powerful, charismatic racist in our school, which was naturally desegregating, moved onto my street. And I believed that by allying myself with that guy, I could become safe, which led me into a lot of horrific situations and despicable behavior. In my reading tonight from the memoir, I'm really going to focus on my father, who passed away 6 months ago. And he had very mixed feelings. In fact, our relationship about my writing was extremely fraught. And before I talk in particular about what I'm reading tonight, I'll just give you an example. I really kept my writing this book away from him. We never talked about it. He didn't know about it. I, in fact, thought that he would die because he'd been ill for a long time before the book came out. When the book came out, there was a full-page article about me in the Baton Rouge paper with a very large photo. And he was in the hospital just about to go into hospice, and I get a phone call, and he says, "Well, Tim, I read the article in the paper. I just want to say I'm really proud of you, and that's a good picture, too." So I was like, "Well, thank you, Daddy. That makes me very happy." And I just wanted to get off the subject because I didn't want to cause him any more pain, and I was hoping, and I don't think he really comprehended what it was about. So the next day on Facebook, I got a post from somebody who worked in the hospital and was a complete stranger to him and somewhat a stranger to me. She had popped into his room and said, "Mr. Parrish, what do you think of Tim's new books?" And he said, "Filth, pure filth." So that sort of summed up the way our relationship about my writing. He was proud that I did it, and I think he was proud of the kind of integrity that I showed in pursuing it and trying to tell my truth, but also he thought it was probably a betrayal to the code of family, and it outed my family and other people in a way that he wasn't comfortable with. Plus, I'm the liberal professor who's betrayed my Southern roots. Tonight, I'm going to focus on a little background about him, what an incredible storyteller he was. In fact, he's the person that made me value stories, made me want to be a storyteller. And the root conflict he had with being a Christian and a very compassionate person one-on-one, but still being a racist when he fell into these generalizations and stereotypes that, of course, he was raised with, but continued to adhere to because he cherry-picked information, which is the only way stereotypes can survive. And then skip way ahead to after the heart of the worst kind of racial violence and confusion I was in, to an event in which I thought I was defending the honor of my neighborhood and a code. It really harkens back to sort of Civil War ideas. I didn't really have any idea what the code was or exactly what I was protecting, except that African Americans were moving into our neighborhood and I was in the middle of white flight. But I thought there was some larger significance in something being taken away from my parents. So I got in this ridiculous fight at school and got suspended, and I thought my father was going to be proud of me. Well, it turned out he not only wasn't proud of me, he took a stand, a very moral stand, that kind of boiled down to do what I say, not what I do, even though he hadn't really said don't do that. But he just carried a kind of moral heft that I knew was at his core when he told me what I'd done was not the right thing to do. And so tonight I want in the reading to kind of give these bookends of my relationship to him as a boy, wondering, okay, how do I take what this man is showing me and use that to become a man, and then how I enacted some of those lessons in a really negative, dangerous way and he still came through and rose above his worst self to find his better angel and pass it on to me. But no matter what the subject matter or tone, darkness and conflicted emotions from whatever source, fatigue from plant work, worry over the future, Christian guilt, often underpinned his telling. Daddy grew up on a Depression-era farm in Mississippi, the son of a volatile man who used a razor strop on his boys whenever they gave him nonsense. When he worried we would turn out wrong, he took a belt to our behinds, but his unreadable sternness and unclear expectations were much worse. And yet the stories defined him, self-deprecating stories about courage, revenge, character, defiance, and mischief. The story of loosening the band on an insufferable supervisor's hard hat so that when he plopped it onto his head, it dropped over his eyes. The story of Daddy popping his own kneecap back into place during a high school football game. The story of Daddy and another plant operator rescuing a coworker knocked out by phosgene gas. The story from his first day in chow line on a new ship. In the latter story, he had been working on Midway and was dressed in a non-standard camouflage uniform when the server refused to give him any potatoes. Fella kept on smart-assing me how I wasn't going to get none, so I just reached over and grabbed his collar and snatched him across that counter. I said, "Boy, you best give me some taters before I whoop your ass." Daddy laughed and held his flat belly. He started going, yes, sir, and give me a big old heap. Word went around I was some kind of commando because of them camouflage clothes, and I got all the taters I wanted after that. How could I see my father as scared? Before I was old enough to understand, he had switched us to a country church 20 miles outside of town. The Southern Baptist pastor in the church 2 blocks from our house had suggested that the church take a vote on whether blacks should be allowed to attend. And even though no blacks yet lived within a mile of our church, and none would have tried to come, just the consideration drove Daddy away. If work allowed, he went to church 3 times a week. He returned thanks to Jesus before every meal, read the Bible often, and demanded we be good Christians so we wouldn't burn in hell. How then to make Christian sense of his worry about ends taking our neighborhood, and his saying that black agitators should be shot dead in the street? When footage of blacks being bitten by dogs and hosed and beaten by police came on TV, his rage heated the room almost as if he were inflicting the punishment. Worst of all, although I wouldn't realize it until much later, he was something close to glad when the Kennedys were assassinated and said of Martin Luther King that he was faking his death and would rise in 3 days saying he was the new black Christ. And yet he would also tell the racially contradictory story about his train trip home from the war, one of the stories that didn't often emerge from his repertoire. His journey from the Pacific had brought him back to California, and from there, he and thousands of other returning servicemen were loaded onto a giant train that would travel for days across the Southwest, Texas, Louisiana, and on, dropping Daddy and the other Mississippians not far from home. The lightness and joy fell away when he told this story, his voice growing serious. We heard they was beating Jews and Inns at the other end of the train. This was a long train, but we hadn't seen none of that in our cars. About the 3rd day, these Inn boys showed up in our car where they wasn't supposed to be, and they were scared to death. They was going, they's beating people bad back there, and they's working their way down here. His impersonation of their accent was heavy. There was 4 of them, just old farmhands from Mississippi like us. So we put them up in our bunks, even let them sleep in there with us, head to foot, while these sons of bitches kept going up and down the aisle all night, asking if we'd seen any Inns. When we got to Jackson, them boys got off, and they was going, thank you, sirs, thank you, thank you. I didn't comprehend the fearful roots of his fury, but I sensed the contradictions in him as a hum in my subconscious. It was this contradiction between being a man with an urge toward race violence and being a tolerant Christian that would eventually be my struggle. So I spent the day in school with blood all over me. Nobody said anything, nothing happened. Went home that night, got my nose set, made jokes about it to my mother, who was completely appalled. And by the next day, we still hadn't told my daddy. He worked the night shift and I went to school. So the next day I got to school, and I thought there was going to be some sort of recognition of, I guess, what a stud I was, and how I'd stood up for this great cause, yeah, for getting busted in the face and attacking people I didn't even know. But when I got to school, classmates, black and white, started talking to me, and they really showed a kind of disapproval, and I was kind of blown by it, and so this is after that happened. The crowd in the hall squeezed in at me, and I scanned ahead, not only for CJ and the others we'd fought, but for some threat less tangible expanding in my chest. The school had changed again, but not in any way I predicted. The pride I had the day before hadn't been reinforced by anyone. The people I'd fought side by side with had no vision of protecting anything. I'd known this before, but I'd managed to deny it, just as I had with Dyer. It didn't matter, though. Hadn't I fought for justice and a larger ideal? Still, by the time I reached my second period class, I was burning, as much from an inkling of my own willful ignorance as from the reactions to me. No sooner had I sat down than my teacher handed me a slip to report to the principal's office. My shoulders and back stiffened as I made my way toward Tank's office. Even though he had possibly saved me from worse injury, I had no respect for him. I assumed he was calling me to use my fighting as an excuse to take revenge for my having quit basketball the year before when the coach and I had squared off in his office. The secretary told me to go straight in, and when I entered the office, there sat Daddy in front of Tank's desk, his hair still wet from a shower, his eyes tired but fiery. "Take a seat," Tank said. I sat next to Daddy without looking at him. Tank leaned back majestically with his hands crossed in front of his chest. His head was a huge gray-haired rectangle, his jaw transplanted from a T-Rex. I'm not kidding. I've been so self-absorbed, I never considered repercussions at school. Dyer had never been called to the office, so why should I suspect that I would, since I was the one whose nose was shattered? More than that, I assumed Tank would like that I had fought hooligan blacks. "Mr. Parrish," Tank said, "I called your father in to tell him what went on yesterday, and I wanted you to be here when I did." He looked at Daddy. "Your son helped instigate a large fight yesterday morning. I saw him fighting with several other young men, and I removed him and told him to stay. He went right back in and started to fight again." Removed, even his diction pissed me off. But his lie was the worst, no matter how meaningless to the main issue. Tank was lying about my going back in, and I wanted to jump across the desk. He leaned forward and focused on me. "This is a very serious offense, Tim," he said, and his using my first name sickened me. "You are an honor student, and you are supposed to set an example of behavior, not attack other students. It's very disappointing." He leaned back. "In the light of all of this, I am suspending you for 1 week beginning immediately." He slid some paperwork across his nearly barren desk. Honor student, I'd always assumed being smart was a mark against me with him. My mind could only process how I had been wronged, how the truth had been altered to show that I was in the wrong. Why didn't Daddy stand up for me? Maybe he didn't know who and why I'd fought. Daddy signed the form, still having never looked at me, then stood and shook hands with Tank. Daddy thanked him and assured him that I wouldn't be involved in anything like this again. Tank looked at me, maybe expecting an apology, but I wheeled and left the room. Daddy called up in the hall. "What the hell were you thinking?" he said, and strode toward his car. "Daddy, I don't want to hear a word out of you, embarrassing me and your mama like that, acting like a fool." I followed him into the parking lot where the air pressed warm and wet. "Don't think this is going to be a week off, boy. You're going to get that haircut, too." I had a giant fro. The irony never ended, so. I strained not to curse him or plead with him to listen as I fell behind. He was supposed to be proud. Hadn't I finally done what he wanted, what men of honor were supposed to do, fight what was ours? Tears pushed against the back of my eyes, but I wouldn't let them out. "I thought you'd be happy I fought ends." He turned and faced me, his eyes ablaze. "Where'd you get such an idea?" "I fought ends." I had mostly stopped using the word, but I used it then as a pointed thing. "You don't need to be saying that word. You say it every day. That don't mean you say it. I don't want you fighting nobody unless you have to." "How you know I didn't have to?" I said that was enough. I won't have this out of you." My fist ached to fly at him. He slid into his car and cranked the engine. I'd understood the message behind his stories of men standing up and fighting. I understood his message of the righteousness of cops who clubbed and set dogs on black rioters, of voting to keep blacks out of church, of reveling in the deaths of King and the Kennedys. I understood it even when it troubled me. So why was he treating me as if I had acted incorrectly? Where was his pride? All I saw was more hypocrisy, and it would be many years before I could recognize that he had done the good and right thing, could see that he had risen above his own shortcomings in order to guide me. And then just the final part, again, the irony, one of my best friends was this black guy I played basketball with, and then another guy whom I competed against for quarterback. And when I came back to school after my suspension, he just stepped out in front of me, the second guy who was the first African-American quarterback at my high school in Baton Rouge in the 70s. And he got death threats when he would have a bad game. The guy was so courageous. And he stopped me at the principal's office, and he said, fighting niggas ain't you. And I was like, all right, Eric, I got to go see the principal. And he's like, okay, the assistant principal. I went in, and when I came back out, Eric stepped in my way again, and he said, I'm telling you, Tim, that ain't you. And that moment, that's one of the crucial moments in my life. I mean, that just stuck with me. And when I read in Baton Rouge, he came and brought his 15-year-old son to the reading. It was really kind of beautiful.
It fit very well with Deborah Johnson's work. Her story, her novel, The Secret of Magic, deals with a civil rights lawyer who comes down to Mississippi after a murder, I guess I can say a murder, on a bus after World War II. A soldier is coming home and is taken off the bus and killed, and his body washes up. And Regina Robichaud, the young lawyer from the NAACP, comes down to Revere, Mississippi, to try to puzzle out who did what and what the truth is behind this death. Everyone seems to know what's going on, but no one's willing to speak that truth.
This book opens in October of 1946. And 20 years before this, the author, M.P. Calhoun, had written a book called The Secret of Magic, which was about 3 little children, 1 black and 2 white, and they were playing in a magical forest. Regina had read this book. So when a letter comes, it had been instrumental in her life because it was the first book that she'd ever read that had an African-American, a little black boy, on the cover and throughout the book. And it was a bestseller in its time, a fictional bestseller. And so when the letter arrives from Mary Pickett Calhoun asking Thurgood Marshall at the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund to come down and investigate the disappearance of a decorated African-American soldier after the Second World War, she persuades him that she's the one that should go. And this is actually based on history. This part is fiction. But in 1947-48, Constance Baker Motley, who was the first woman hired by Thurgood Marshall at the fund, did actually come down to Mississippi to do early investigative work. In The Secret of Magic, I really wanted to write, aside from Thurgood Marshall, I wanted to write about the end of World War II because I think that the ending of World War II marked a major world shift in people's thinking, probably what came out at Nuremberg, and began civil rights movements as we know them now, which began essentially with Gandhi and moved to Martin Luther King, the women's movement, on from there. So this is always that particular piece of land, even though it's quite short. You enter Lowndes County before you enter the state of Mississippi, coming out of Tuscaloosa, Birmingham. And that just so intrigued me. It can't just be an anomaly of the signs, but I always have thought of that little stretch as just a no man's land. And in the book, this is the place where I have Joe Howard Wilson, who will shortly disappear. He is on a courier bus coming from Birmingham through Tuscaloosa, through Aliceville, Alabama, and this bus is stopped there, and men take him off. And the last thing that he sees is he looks up and he sees the trees and he sees mistletoe in them. And his father, who's like his father is like very interested in the trees and everything. And his father had told him that when the mistletoe falls and it touches you, you can make a wish. The men he'd led onto the bus and were now passing right through the white section and coming on into colored only were prisoners. There were red PWs on their belts. Germans, thought Joe Howard, prisoners of war. Maybe about to go home just like he was going home. Joe Howard settled back into his uncomfortable seat. He didn't see how these men had a thing in the world to do with him until they stopped, until he heard the guard say, "You coloreds get on up. Give over these places to these here men." All around him, Joe heard the slow shuffle of people gathering their things to move. A woman groaned to her feet behind him. Across the way, an old black man reached for his pine cane. Even Manasseh, who had not budged even to go to the bathroom, started gathering his lard bucket together, started shuffling, started to obey. Joe Howard could not believe it. He could not believe it. You want us to get up and give our places that we paid for to some German prisoners. The guard's face flared into a mottled map of angry affirmation. Could this be a black man talking back to him? Yes, he damn well did want that. "What I want," he said, talking slow now and loud, "is for you niggers to get up and give these here places over to white men." When he said them, the words sounded as reasonable and as inevitable as the fact that the sun would rise again in the east the next day. It was just simply the way things were, the way they had always been, the way they were always going to be. "I'm not getting up," he said, as he actually jumped to his feet and stood there, blocking the way with his uniform. "And nobody else back here is getting up either, not for some Nazis." The other deputy came up behind him fast. He stared at Joe Howard, at his uniform, at his bars, at his medals. "Well, look-a-here, Leroy," he began. "Maybe." Compromise was in his voice, but the man called Leroy was having none of it. "I said, move aside here, nigger. Give those white men your place. And I said that I'm not moving, and neither is anybody else." Each word clear and distinct, and with the feel of his friend Elsie's blood fresh on him again, the warm iron smell of it, the sticky, drained life. Joe Howard felt those always near tears well up in him, threatening his eyes, threatening him, just like they had so long ago on the streets of Atlanta, and just like they would always. It was the tears that told him that the war, his part in it, the long horror of it, hadn't changed one thing. By now, all the white people had turned around, and they were looking too. Joe Howard saw the one he thought he knew, Miss Anna Dale. It was her, a prim lady in a lace collar and a polka dot dress and a green hat with lilacs blooming on it, with a polished gold star pinned to her ample bosom. He saw all of that now. She stared at him with dark, deep eyes. Joe Howard heard her whisper, "Oh dear."
Along the same lines, Matthew Gwynne is also dealing in his novel, The Resurrectionist, with themes of race and not exactly murder, but grave robbing back prior to the Civil War and extending beyond the Civil War, with a slave who was bought by a medical school in order to go dig up bodies to be cadavers in the anatomy classes. It tells the story of this resurrectionist, Nemo, the slave, who then is free later in the novel, and also tells a contemporary story of the medical student who's trying to piece together this story from the past.
in a way, I think maybe I don't abstractly set out to write about race or class, but there's so much about somebody becoming. And that's what the screenwriters call a character arc. Where does the character start at the beginning and where does he or she? And Nemo was based on the real life Grandison Harris at the Medical College of Georgia in Augusta, who taught anatomy. There's written evidence that he was bought as a slave to steal cadavers out of the African American cemetery in Augusta so that they could dissect them for gross anatomy at the school. But he developed such a skill set that the great tragedy of that real person, Grandison Harris, is that had he been born a century later, he would have been a surgeon or a general practitioner. He would have been a doctor. And that was the best part of writing Nemo, was just trying to think, now seriously, take yourself out of this writing chair in this comfortable house and imagine yourself there. And so that was, and his final revenge was my favorite thing to write in the novel. The idea that somebody said something really kind on some blog or something that the person who appears to be the cleverest in the room may not actually be. And I think I just always root for the underdog and love the idea that the haughty might get schooled. The singing ended, and the rector rose to the pulpit, bespectacled and awed and looking especially stern. Without preamble, he leaned upon the great Bible propped before him and read, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye are like unto whited sepulchres, which indeed appear beautiful outward, but are within full of dead men's bones and of all uncleanness. Even so, ye also outwardly appear righteous unto men, but within ye are full of hypocrisy and iniquity." So says Christ Jesus, the rector said, in chapter 23 of Matthew's Gospel. And it is a text with particular application to the congregation gathered here today. Nemo leaned forward in his seat, hardly believing his luck. Years now since he had last emerged from this building with the bilious taste of its bland hypocrisy in his mouth, and he had sworn then that he had quit this God-forsaken place for good. But now, on his first day back, the white preacher had welcomed him with a homecoming message, the truth at last. He gazed down upon the rows of white parishioners below and thought, "You've had it coming, and now you're going to get it, and all your chattel up here to witness it. For it has come to be known here in Columbia," said the rector, "and throughout the South, that conditions within our domestic sphere, untouched by northern aggression, are not so blessedly tranquil as they have lately seemed." The rector's face was tilted upwards, as was Nemo. Nemo was beginning to wonder if the God he had heard discussed so warmly since he had landed in Charleston might not be showing his presence after all. But when Nemo lowered his gaze from the timbered ceiling, he saw that the preacher's eyes were raised not to heaven, but to the balcony. "My sable brethren," he said, "these dry bones are not just the sins of the gambling house, the saloon, the bedchamber of your neighbor's wife. These dry bones of iniquity are also the hardness of heart you may feel toward your masters. For as our Savior Christ has told us, we are all servants and should be humble, gracious, obedient. This is no less true for the child of Africa than for the sons and daughters of Europe. Nay, it is even more so." Nemo leaned back, settling against the pew heavily. It seemed that the preacher had read the morning paper too. He allowed himself to drift for a few moments then, knowing that he had been burned again by this great white machine, all-powerful, with its plodding and knowing tentacles stretched out a half-mile farther down any road he had yet chosen to travel. So for some minutes his mind was elsewhere, as it often was on moonless nights in Cedar Vale, prospecting among the remains of his people for forage to sneak through the back door of the medical school. As he did then, he thought not of this steaming Southland, but of vast dry plains far away, of mile-wide suns setting savannas afire with the orange glow of sunset. But the rector's voice kept bringing him back, and the eyes, the pale blue eyes quick with life. Every time the preacher looked up from his text, they rose to the balcony, scorching and accusative. When Nemo knew that Dr. Ballard, down front and center in the pews, had just performed an appendectomy on the rector's daughter, Margaret, cauterizing the wound as he'd practiced on the body of Bernice McCallan's mother, and Bernice herself sitting 2 rows behind him now. Nemo thought back to assisting at the dress rehearsal of that procedure in the anatomy lab, the suturing and tying of Ms. McCallan's dead appendix, when the preacher's voice returned to him, the words seeping into his consciousness like the bite of formaldehyde in the nose. "And hear me well, you servants, destined for a higher station in the glorious hereafter," the preacher said. Always, always, Nemo thought, a better place once dead. Poor Ms. McCallan hadn't gotten there yet, as far as he could see. "Repentance never comes too late. I urge you to bring your dry bones into the light, to confess the sins of your plotting against your masters. I say to you, my black brothers, come forward and confess your sins, and even the scribes and Pharisees among you will be forgiven." Nemo felt it welling up inside him, stronger than anything he'd felt in years. Maybe it was Dr. Ballard sitting down front in his white suit, looking innocent as a lamb, pure as a whited sepulchre. Maybe it was Bernice McCallan murmuring, "Yes, Lord," behind him, knowing nothing of the busy week her mama had had at the college before he laid her in the basement under a thick coat of lime. Maybe it was even the news from All Saints Parish, turning the tide down by the whack-a-mole, swapping bone for bone. Probably it was all these things. He saw it all now, this sermon, this moment, as the punchline to a great cosmic joke, 200 years of irony echoing across the oceans from Africa to Colombia. And because he could do little else, he began to laugh. A chuckle at first, and one of his pew mates shushed him, but the preacher was off again on the dirty bones, and Nemo, bone man himself, cackled aloud. Bowing over with it, he saw that he had clamped a hand on his neighbor's knee, that of Tyree's niece, who sat wall-eyed, transfixed and petrified by this contact in spite of the indignity. "No, child," he said, "I ain't no Satan. Devil's in the good seats," he said, his throat itching, "downstairs on the ground floor." He was gone then, beyond restraint. A basso roar, peals of his laughter cascaded down from the balcony. Faces turned up to its source, reddening, none of them redder than Dr. Ballard's when he spotted Nemo. A handful of men rose and made their way up the aisle. In seconds, he could hear them pounding up the stairs. "That's right, white folks, send up the deacons," he shouted, before exploding again. There was a shuffle behind him, and Nemo felt hands hooking him under his arms. He had only a second to dab his glistening cheeks with his handkerchief before they hauled him up. Downstairs, they hurled him clear of the nave steps onto the sidewalk. Rising, he replaced his pocket square and adjusted the bowler back to its steep angle. He set out for home with the gold cane tapping the sidewalk bricks smartly, evenly, his head held high. He was smiling again, for Nemo Johnston was superfine, a man among men, and, despite the rough handling, entirely beyond their reach.
Our fourth interviewed writer was Mary Miller, and hers is a little bit different. She doesn't deal so much with race in her work, but she's dealing with the struggles with family, with finding two young women finding their own identities as they're traveling with their families across the United States, believing that the second coming is about to happen, or at least the father believes that, and everyone else goes along with this journey. But also the two young women exploring their own freedom, their own sexuality. One of them, the elder daughter, is recently found out she's pregnant. The younger daughter, our narrator, is trying to wrap her mind around what this means and how she now sees her sister, and then how she sees herself. And there's a lot of longing and loss in that family along the way.
I started the book shortly after the rapture did not happen in May of 2011. Harold Camping had predicted the rapture would occur, I believe, for the second or third time. And it was getting a lot of press in Mississippi, and I was home with my parents. And when I'm in Jackson with my parents, I watch the news with my dad and read the paper with my dad. I kind of just, and I read a newspaper article about a man who drove his family from the East Coast to the West Coast to await the rapture in Pacific time. And there were really no details about the story except that he had done this or was in the process of doing this. And it just seemed very bizarre and strange that he'd take his family on this pilgrimage. So I started wondering who these people were and whether they were so different from my family and what the pilgrimage was really about. You know, was it just about the rapture? Was it just so they could proselytize? Was it, I mean, it was just, I don't know. I wanted to know more about them and I couldn't, and there was no other information, so I just decided to make up my own story for them.
Soon after we got back on the road, the sky turned green and the lightning began, splitting the sky in half. I hadn't seen lightning like that in a long time, maybe ever, though I'd once seen a tornado spinning off in the distance when my father and I went to pick up Elise from cheerleading practice. As soon as the funnel was gone, it was like something out of a dream. The wind blew the car from side to side. It blew trash out of the beds of pickups, bags and boxes my father weaved around in case there was anything inside of them. A few fat drops hit the windshield, and then there was the quiet moment while we waited for the downpour to begin. The rain came all at once, battering the car. Our father slowed to a crawl and put on his hazards as 18-wheelers hurtled past. The windows fogged, and he yelled at our mother to fix them, so she fiddled with the temperature control, blasts of hot air followed by blasts of cold. I took off my seatbelt and scooted forward, my head between their shoulders. I couldn't make anything out except the brake lights of the car in front of us and the occasional glimpse of white line. My father pulled onto the shoulder and put the car in park. We could get rear-ended here, my mother said, as the vehicles whooshing past us rattled our doors. This shoulder's big, he said. It was a big shoulder, much bigger than the ones in Alabama. Cars passed on them, used them as extended turn lanes. There was a whole protocol to this big shoulder that we hadn't figured out yet. My mother shoved my head into the back seat like she did with Cole. Put your seatbelt back on, she said. I put it on and looked out the window. I liked to track the drops, but there was just a smear. Elise stuck her feet in my lap and told me to rub. Why, are they swollen? I asked, fingering one of her smooth red toenails. She punched me in the arm so hard I'd probably have a bruise in the morning. I closed my eyes. When I saw the lightning flash through my eyelids, I counted the seconds until thunder. After a while, the rain slacked and our father pulled back onto the road, but it was the same as before, nothing but brake lights and glimpses of white line. It's hard to believe Noah was the only man worth saving, Elise said. If he thought Noah was the only man worth saving, he was, our father said. I mean, how many people were alive back then, and they were all bad? That's just really hard to believe. I pressed my forehead to the glass and banged it softly, while Elise argued the scientific evidence against the flood, which seemed like very solid evidence despite my unwillingness to listen. And then our father argued what was meant by the world. He spoke of ancient wood and 7 types of mussels, and his evidence seemed solid as well. But then Elise got angry. She always got angry first. And he said, "Why don't we save it for this evening when we aren't in the middle of a deluge?" I had never heard him use this word before and didn't think he had pronounced it correctly. "I don't want to save it for this evening," I said. "I want to watch Honey, I Shrunk the Kids and order pizza. Can we order pizza?" Nobody said anything. "Hello?" I said. It came out sounding horrible. "If we can find some place to deliver it," my mother said. The road narrowed into 1 lane for road work, and my father bumped an orange cone. It wobbled but didn't go down. My mother put a hand on the back of his neck and told him he was doing a good job, which she did when he was doing a bad job. And I got this spacey, out-of-body feeling I got sometimes, like I wasn't real, like nothing was real, so nothing mattered. We could drive off a cliff and I wouldn't care. And then the feeling was gone and I was back inside my body. I turned my hands, palms up, and slowly moved my fingers, thinking, these are your hands, you are moving your hands. Sometimes I found this incredible, but now it just seemed dumb. Of course they were my hands, of course I could move them. By the time the rain stopped, our father's nerves were shot. At the next town, he pulled into a motel in the kind of place he was trying to save us from. 2 motels, 2 fast food restaurants, a gas station, and a bar. But all the small towns were like this. The factories had closed, and people were left with a few places to regroup on their way to some place better. Except they didn't go any place better. How did they survive? I bet most of them were on disability or welfare. We stayed in the car while he went into the office, the radio playing Taylor Swift and Garth Brooks. Halfway through Martina McBride, he gave the thumbs up and we got out. The pavement wasn't wet. It looked like it hadn't rained here at all. Did we get our own room, Elise asked. Not tonight, he said. I thought you were putting everything on your credit card. The way Elise figured it, the credit card was free money since my father didn't believe he'd be around to pay it back. She didn't understand why we weren't staying at 4-star hotels, sleeping in plush, king-sized beds. While we gathered our stuff, our mother pointed out that the motel was being renovated. TVs had been wheeled outside, bed frames and mattresses leaned against the walls, carpets rolled and stacked. Our room, however, didn't look like it had been renovated since the place had been built a very long time ago. We set our luggage down, and our father went to get ice, first thing like he always did. I went to the bathroom, which was handicapped, bars everywhere and a sticky mat in the tub so you wouldn't slip and bust your head, which made me not want to take a shower after all. I propped an elbow on a bar and listened to Elise complain. Only drug addicts wore black t-shirts, she said, and boys who ate foot-long sandwiches and read manga in the lunchroom. Girls like Elise didn't even sit in the lunchroom. They sat in the little waterless ditch in the courtyard, their legs stretched out so they could get a suntan. They passed around bags of grapes and baby carrots because they found eating in public humiliating, and if they had to do it, they would eat only foods that were clean and neat. I opened the door and scooted past them, peeled the spread off the bed closest to the bathroom. It was smooth and silky on top, but pilled underneath. I peeled back the top sheet and looked for the short black hairs that were often woven into the thread. I didn't see any, so I got in and pulled the sheet up to my chin. It smelled clean, like bleach, and I thought of a show I'd seen about pests people couldn't get rid of. The family with bed bugs had closed them up in a suitcase and carried them home from a motel just like this one. The bugs were hardy and adapted to survive, moving up and down the stairs on the children's stuffed animals. I listened to the sounds of renovation, things falling and being ripped out, while Elise and my mother droned on in the background. My mother spoke in the slow, controlled voice she'd been using a lot lately, a voice that begged us not to give her a hard time. I got out of bed, opened the door, and stepped outside. The motel was 2-story and horseshoe-shaped, the lot nearly full. I didn't see my father. A worker stepped out of the room next to ours. He was small and covered in a fine white dust. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Putting in carpet," he said. I nodded, and we shared a moment. "Do you want new carpet in your room?" he asked. I tried to think of something to say. Did he think we lived here? "Not today," I said, and he went back into the room he'd come out of. I closed the door and got back in bed. I wasn't gathering enough information. I tried to think of what else I could have asked him, but couldn't come up with anything. I'd have had to start at the beginning. What was his name? Where was he born? Did he have a wife, kids? But all of these things seemed meaningless. "Fine," Elise said. "I'll wear King Jesus tomorrow if you want. I'll wear it for the rest of my life if you want." They're all wearing black shirts that say King Jesus Returns on them. "Jess, get me the detergent out of my carry-on," my mother said. "Come on, take them off." We took off our shirts and threw them at her. Then we put on the Old Navy tank tops we liked to sleep in fast before our father returned. They were Christmas-themed. Mine was red with white snowflakes, and hers was white with red candy canes. For some reason, we only thought to buy them at Christmas. I wish you'd just let me stay home, Elise said. We're working on a new routine and I'm going to be behind. She sat at my feet and fell between my legs. I kicked and scooted over and she came clambering up the bed and stuck her face in mine. We're not going back, I said as dramatically as possible. She put her finger up my nostril. Stop molesting me, I said, throwing the covers over my head. I didn't want to go to heaven if Elise wasn't going to be there. I'd have to take my chances on earth. We'd make our way home and find Cole, or he'd find us, and then we'd locate the key to the gun case and catalog the contents of the pantry before planning a garden in the wide, flat backyard, the place where we had always imagined a pool. She'd give birth to a healthy baby girl, or maybe a boy, our own boy. And I'd work hard all day, and at night I'd be so tired it wouldn't occur to me to sleep badly. But then I thought about every post-apocalyptic movie I'd ever seen and how we wouldn't be able to stay there because men would want our guns and our food. They'd want us to have their babies in order to repopulate the world, all of the pretense of love gone.